Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum. So you may recall just the other day I released a video in which I respond to an article where someone tries to explain that taxation isn't theft. A link to that video will be in the description. In case you haven't seen it, basically what they're arguing is that since the market is this random amoral system, the amount of money that you earn based on the market isn't an accurate reflection of what you actually deserve, and therefore that justifies the government coming in, taking your money, and redistributing it according to what people actually deserve. Now there are a lot of problems with this point of view, which I discussed thoroughly in my video, but as it turns out I'm not the first person to make a response to this video on YouTube. As it turns out, Tom Woods, a famous libertarian podcaster, also offered his opinion on the article and debunks it as well, and he does a pretty good job of it. A link to that will be in the description as well. Now the folks over at the Tax Justice Network, that is the organization responsible for publishing the original article, caught wind of Mr. Woods' response and decided to release a part 2 to the article, and that's what I'll be looking at today, so sit back and enjoy. So the article starts off with the following, quote, "It came to our attention recently that a blog written for us by Associate Professor of Philosophy at Central European University, Philip Goff, prompted extensive discussion. The blog was called, 'No, It's Not Your Money, Why Taxation Isn't Theft.' This concept that taxes paid by individuals and companies used by government for the provision of public services are somehow theft seems to excite a lot of people. Do we believe all government expenditure is responsible and fair? No. But to end all debate by proposing presumably no one should pay any taxes doesn't look like an inviting world in which to live happy and prosper. Associate Professor Philip Goff has written a response based on the reaction to his previous blog, and we hand it over to him." End quote. So right off the bat, I'm a little bit shocked that this was actually written by a philosophy professor. I mean, if it was some like liberal arts professor or something like that, where it's like they're stuck in an ivory tower all day with a silver spoon in their mouth, like Douglas Amy in charge of that government website, they'll be like, yeah, okay, I kind of see it. But you're telling me that someone who spent over 6 years studying philosophy couldn't have picked up on all the fundamental logical errors he was making in that article? Because here's the thing, my degree is in computer science, I work in IT. Philosophy is something I study on the side as a personal interest. This person, on the other hand, actually does it as a career, so you think he would actually be more savvy about it than me. But anyways, getting back on subject, we see quite a bit of poisoning the well here in this first paragraph. Just sort of taking it from the top, this person mentions that taxes are used by the government to provision public services, as if that is in any way at all relevant as to whether or not taxation is theft. If the before mentioned individuals and companies aren't paying into it of their own volition, if they're being coerced into it, then it is theft, regardless of how the government uses that money. Now maybe you could argue that, okay, well, since it is being provisioned to provide public services, maybe it's a justified form of theft, but unless I agree to it, unless there's a way to opt out, then it's theft. We see a similar issue arise when they mention that, well, not all government expenditures are responsible and fair. The problem is that this once again dodges the main criticism against taxation. You see, no system is perfect. Not all free market expenditures are responsible or fair, but all exchanges in the free market are voluntary. There's no coercion. Nobody points a gun at you and says you have to buy this or sell that. And the upshot of this is that this incentivizes expenditures that are more responsible and fair, because your company's not going to make very much money if nobody's doing business with you, or if you're wasting a bunch of money on bullshit that's not turning a profit. So nobody's arguing that private sector expenditures are necessarily perfect. It's just that they tend to be more efficient than government expenditures, for the simple reason that because there's a choice in the matter, there's impetus on people to be more efficient. And the way they portray the other argument at the end of that paragraph is just straight up dishonest. We're not trying to end the debate. We want to keep the conversation going. Authoritarians are the ones who tend to want to end the debate by appealing to vague concepts like the greater good in society, which are vague enough to encompass basically anything and therefore be really difficult to attack. Next, not all libertarians argue that nobody should be paying taxes. Do some libertarians want to altogether abolish taxation? Yes. But some of them don't necessarily want to get rid of taxation but keep it to a minimum. Or a lot of libertarians, and this is what I personally believe, argue that there should be a tax system where citizens have more of a choice. So instead of the government just taking your money and spending on whatever the fuck they want, you as a citizen would be able to sort of pick and choose which government services you wanted. So trying to boil down the entire libertarian position on taxation to simply it shouldn't exist is just a vast oversimplification. And finally, well, who says that without taxation we wouldn't live happy and prosper? Sure, maybe taxation does pay for a lot of the important things we need in society, but it's not like it's the only possible way that we can provision these things. I mean, there's very clearly a need for these services to be provisioned, and therefore there would be a market incentive for someone to come along and provide them. See, it's the very first paragraph of the article and already have a bunch of criticisms. That's not a good sign. Quote, an episode of a libertarian podcast series recently discussed a piece I wrote a few years ago for the Tax Justice Network on the ethics of taxation. I thought this was a pretty interesting and intelligent discussion, and well worth listening to. End quote. Notice how he doesn't mention the name of the podcast, nor is a link provided to the podcast anywhere on the article's webpage. While this may seem like a minor nitpick, I do consider it important to provide a link to, or at least some way to find the original source that you're criticizing. That way I can go verify that you're not misquoting or misrepresenting or taking anything out of context. This is important because in this article they do frequently misrepresent or take things out of context that were said in the Tom Woods podcast. And it really does make you wonder whether this was an honest omission or if they really wanted to cover up the fact that they're misrepresenting what he said. Quote, the setup, however, was a little disingenuous. One gets the impression listening to the show that libertarianism is entirely free of evaluative assumptions, and that in contrast the opponents of libertarianism are hopelessly mirrored in contentious assumptions about what is or isn't valuable. They continually point out, for example, that in my piece I didn't argue for a specific view about how wealth ought to be distributed. A little much to expect for a 1,000-word article, end quote. Actually, what's really disingenuous here is that you seem to be putting words in his mouth. I mean, I watched that whole podcast, and at no point do I actually remember him saying anything along the lines of libertarianism makes no evaluative assumptions. I don't know, maybe if you can provide me with a timestamp for where specifically in the video he said that, but as far as I remember, I don't remember anyone making the claim that libertarianism makes absolutely zero assumptions. Now, regarding the second point, the theory of how wealth ought to be distributed. Well, if you're making the claim that the system we currently have doesn't adequately distribute wealth, well, in order to make that claim, there'd have to be some more accurate theory of wealth distribution against which you can compare and evaluate it. For example, suppose that my air conditioner isn't working and I want to know how to fix it. In order to do that, I need to have some sort of a concept in mind of what a functioning air conditioner is, how it works, so that I have some sort of a basis of comparison against the broken air conditioner, so I know, okay, in the working air conditioner, this is like this, in the broken one, this is not like that. Basically, I need to figure out, isolate what about it is broken, and the only way I can do that is if I have a functioning air conditioner to use as a backdrop of evaluation. By that same token, if you're trying to argue that our current system of wealth distribution is broken, so to speak, you'd have to point to a functioning wealth redistribution system that we can use as a backdrop of comparison to see what exactly it is about our system that's broken. And there's the simple fact that we just need a system of wealth distribution. Going back to the air conditioner example, suppose that you suggest, well, you should get rid of your air conditioner. Well, considering that I would prefer my home to be at a livable temperature, I'm going to need a suggestion as to what to replace it with if you want me to take your suggestion seriously. By that same token, we have to distribute wealth somehow, and the market is what we have. Maybe it's not 100% perfect or fair, but it works. And if you want us to get rid of something that we not only need, but works perfectly fine, if you want any even remote chance of being taken seriously, you need some sort of suggestion as what to replace it with. Because you can sit there and bash and criticize the market all you want, but until we come up with a better system, it's what we have. The only alternative to the market is basically no interactions whatsoever, no economic interactions whatsoever, and then we're basically back to the Paleolithic era where everybody's doing their own everything. Quote, the truth is that libertarianism is itself knee-deep in highly contentious evaluative assumptions. It's easy to overlook this when we imagine that libertarianism is all about free exchange between consenting adults, but the whole system doesn't get off the ground unless we make two assumptions about natural rights. Assumption A. Each human has a natural and morally fundamental right of ownership over her or his own body. And assumption B. humans can acquire natural and morally fundamental rights of ownership over land and material objects in the external world, end quote. So notice how the author is trying to portray these as just whimsical assumptions that libertarians just believe, rather than going in detail on the actual logic and reasoning that supports each of them. For example, how self-ownership comes from the consistency principle. Also, the premise regarding property rights isn't a separate assumption from the premise of self-ownership. Your time and labor is part of yourself, and your time and labor is what results in your property, ergo your right to yourself logically entails a right to your property. So basically what this person is trying to portray as these two totally separate ideas that can exist in isolation of each other are actually concepts that build off of each other. Quote, "Assumption A is pretty plausible, although not entirely uncontroversial. A utilitarian would claim that our rights over our own bodies are grounded in facts about the promotion of well-being, but assumption B is incredibly contentious, and indeed it is defended only by a small minority of moral and political philosophers. Even smaller if we set aside the left libertarians who argue that assumption B is compatible with egalitarianism." End quote. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what utilitarianism is, it's a theory of ethics saying that the right thing to do in any given situation is whatever will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. While it may sound good on paper, there's actually quite a few problems with it, which I'll probably make a video discussing at some point here. But anyways, once again we see the author trying to claim that this is some kind of empty assumption with no foundation whatsoever. But as I've explained before, if you accept premise A, you kind of have to accept premise B. If you own yourself, that means you own your time and labor. And if you own your time and labor, then you kind of have to own the results of your time and labor. Or to phrase it differently, if you think slavery is wrong, you kind of have to believe in property rights. Because if it's wrong for someone to take advantage of your time and labor against your will directly, why would it be any better for them to do so indirectly after the fact? And finally, the author mentions that this point of view isn't held by very many political philosophers, as if that actually is relevant at all. Saying that an idea has merit based on how many people agree with it or believe in it is called argumentum ad populum, or the bandwagon fallacy. Who cares if no political philosophers agree with it? If you think it's wrong, give me an argument for why you believe it's wrong. Quote, "This is not to say that there is no such thing as property, but it is generally assumed that property rights are social constructions rather than natural rights, which we can shape as we choose according to what we take to be valuable. On the one hand, many think it is important for human flourishing that a person has some things over which they can express their autonomy. Hence there is a need for legally protected property rights. On the other hand, many judge it morally important to ensure that each person has enough for a decent standard of living, and that the gap between the haves and have-nots does not become too wide. Hence, the need to make the right to property conditional on the payment of taxes to facilitate the redistribution of wealth." End quote. So first of all, real quick, let's discuss this idea of property as a social construct. Imagine that somebody lives on an island by themselves, and they spend all day going around chopping down trees, gathering up wood to build a canoe. Now suppose that someone in a ship happens to stumble upon that island and see the canoe. Well, this person decides that they like that canoe, they're going to have it, so they take the person's canoe onto their ship and leave with it. Now, according to the theory of property as a social construct, the person who took the canoe didn't actually do anything wrong. Since property is a social construct and this person was living by himself, there was no society around him to determine what his property was. I guess that means the guy didn't actually have any property rights, so the person who stole the results of his time and labor didn't actually do anything wrong. So you can see how absurd the idea of property rights as a social construct is. But even if it was a social construct, that wouldn't necessarily make it arbitrary. It's like the people who say that, well, gender is a social construct, therefore I can decide that my gender is a purple flying elephant. Many people would argue that logic and mathematics is also a construct of man, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's arbitrary or that there's no objective backing to it. Now, one thing this author does get correct is that the ability to have a right to property, the right to exert one's will over one's resources around them, is important for human flourishing. It's what enables us to survive and live a quality life, being able to take advantage of the resources around us. But in order to utilize those resources, in order to make use of them, you have to apply labor and effort. Someone has to put in effort to actually make those resources useful, and this is a problem with the idea that people are entitled to, or that we should ensure that people have equal access to shit, because these things do require someone to put in time and effort and labor to produce them. And well, the question becomes, if you're entitled to that, then from whom are you entitled that time and labor? Who is it exactly that owes you that? Because as I've mentioned previously, if someone else owes you their time and labor against their will, that's the definition of slavery. Aside from the moral implication that it entails slavery, another problem with positive rights is that since resources resources require time and labor to produce, and since you're essentially discouraging people from putting in that time and labor by offering them free shit, you're essentially disincentivizing productivity. Now, this isn't to say that I think people who can't afford their basics shouldn't have any help at all, and of course I'm very supportive of organizations that volunteer to provide support to these people, but the idea that you're entitled to someone else's time and labor for the mere fact that you exist is simply ludicrous. And then they pull the typical left-wing talking point of the income gap being too wide. I mean, who cares how wide the income gap is? I mean, if the standard of living among the lower classes is high, if they're living a comfortable life, then does it really matter how much more wealthy the rich are than them? I mean, if you look at people considered poor in the United States, they have televisions, refrigerators, cars, computers, cell phones. Heck, they have stuff the wealthy and third world countries don't have. So this idea that there's some kind of connection between wealth inequality and quality of life is just ridiculous. And then there's the idea of making the property right conditional upon the payment of taxes. Well, here's the thing. Rights, by definition, can't be conditional. Rights, by definition, are things that you have and are guaranteed to have. If it's conditional, if it's predicated upon some type of condition, then it's not a right, it's a privilege. And finally, the claim that we need taxation to facilitate the redistribution of wealth. What these people on the left tend to overlook when they make these arguments is the role of government in contributing to the overwhelming wealth inequality and poverty. Imagine if there weren't regulations like minimum wage and mandatory benefits that made it a pain in the ass to hire people. Imagine how many more jobs there would be, and therefore less poor people. If it wasn't for the government subsidizing student loans and making them really expensive, how many more people would be able to afford an education and maybe get a higher paying job? And finally, these wealth redistribution programs like welfare and all this, the data shows that these actually hurt the poor more than helping them, because rather than encouraging people to become self-dependent, they become dependent on the government. So a lot of what these left-wingers advocate for in order to help the poor actually ends up screwing them over. Quote, "What are we to do if human judgments about what is valuable conflict? A point continuously returned to in this podcast. I've got a simple, old-fashioned answer. Political parties represent the options and the people vote. Libertarians can argue for their conception of economic justice. Egalitarians and sufficientarians can argue for theirs, and we can let the voters decide." End quote. But isn't that kind of like already what we have with the market? What this guy's basically arguing is that people like you and me should be able to determine what the ideal wealth redistribution should be. But the thing is, the free market already kind of enables that. You know, if you're someone who's concerned with egalitarianism or the plight of the less fortunate, you have the option of spending your money on charity or going to businesses that support charity. We already have the ability to make these choices within the market. What this person basically wants to do is super centralize it and make it so that the majority has things their way and a minority are forced to go along with it, as if this would somehow make it more efficient. Quote, "What are the arguments for Assumption B? None is offered in this podcast. I can understand why ducking the issue is an effective PR strategy for the libertarian. Libertarianism is far more attractive when its moral assumptions, particularly Assumption B, are kept covert, when it presents itself as a simple rallying call for freedom. But the fundamental concern of the libertarian is not freedom, but the protection of natural property rights. The problem is that it's far from obvious that such rights exist." End quote. Well, this is straight up disingenuous. I don't know if it's that they weren't paying attention to the podcast or if they were just straight up lying. Tom Woods did explain the rationale behind property rights in the podcast, particularly how any property obtained ethically through either original development or obtaining it from prior consent of the owner are the ways in which property can be obtained ethically. And even if he didn't mention it, well, it's not like this shit's difficult to figure out. Just go on Google real quick and type in libertarian theories of property rights. I guarantee you have gotten the full gist of it, like homesteading, your right to time and labor, etc. You've gotten all of that within like 4 minutes of a Google search. And then they try to paint a dichotomy between freedom and natural property rights, like those two are somehow mutually exclusive. Well, I mean, if someone else can just help themselves to your property without your consent, then obviously you're not free. And again, yes, natural property rights do exist. Not only was it explained in the podcast that you claim you've watched, but I'm having doubts about reading this, but basically every libertarian out there has provided some sort of explanation as to how it is that property rights arise naturally from your human rights. This person's either lazy or dishonest, because there's no way you could be this fundamentally ignorant in good faith. And there are 2 footnotes at the bottom of the article. This is the first one, quote, "Sufficientarians argue that justice requires that everyone enjoys conditions of life that place them above the threshold that marks the minimum required for a decent, good enough quality of life." End quote. Aside from the problem with positive rights that I've already mentioned, this point of view sufficientarianism suffers from a problem of its own, and that is that threshold for what you consider to be a decent standard of living is totally arbitrary. And this is a typical piece of rhetoric you find in a lot of left-wing arguments, especially regarding like minimum wage and exploitation and this and that people are entitled a livable wage or a livable standard of life. Okay, how do you define that? What if my idea of a livable standard of life is different from yours? Then what? And of course, there's the other arguments I've already mentioned, that in a free capitalist country with a free market, you're much more likely to have those conditions where people live a quality of life that's really high. And government programs that seek to redistribute wealth really don't do anything other than screw over the poor and keep them dependent. Quote, I'm not saying there isn't a fact of the matter as to which theory of justice is correct, but while controversy about the ethical truth persists, we should decide by democracy which conception of justice to aim at, end quote. This really strikes me as a cop-out. Oh, there is an objectively true theory of wealth distribution out there, I just can't argue for it. This is actually rather common authoritarian tactic. When they can't think of a way to back up their bullshit, they just hide behind democracy. Well, why exactly should we decide by democracy? After all, we can't trust the market to determine a fair distribution of income, and while all the market is basically a more decentralized version of democracy, if people aren't going to make fair decisions as what to support in the market, why are they going to make any more fair decisions on what to support in a voting booth? I really don't think you thought this through very well. And this is a typical thing with left-wing arguments, especially regarding wealth distribution. They're very good at tugging at your heartstrings by going on about the plight of the poor and how greedy the rich are. But when you really break it down on a logical basis, you start to see that it doesn't have a leg to stand on. This has been Philosophosa, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.